Hey gang, here's the latest and greatest. Special thanks to Death from Above for sending in his story. I mean, it could have been used as one of my shorter episodes. It is pretty long, but it's great. Last call for crazy ex and scary relationship stories. Get them off to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com for a Valentine's Day special. Alright, enough of this monkeying around. Let's go. My Urbex Story, submitted by Funk You Very Much. I grew up outside of Cincinnati, Ohio, and as a teenager, me and my friends used to get into all kinds of stuff whenever we could. Back in the early 90s, we would crawl around in whatever abandoned places we could find, and I guess you could say we were urbexers before anyone used that term. We would load up our rucksacks with rope, food, and flashlights, and usually lie to our parents where we were going, as the places we went to were off limits and it was considered trespassing to be where we were screwing around. This is the story about a time we braved the subway system that was stopped back in the 20s after money ran out or whatever. It was never used, and I recall hearing that the city couldn't keep up with what it was actually going to cost. So basically, it's a subway system that runs to nowhere. Most of the ways to get in were covered with bars and grates, but you knew a couple of other ways to get in. I went down there with my friends, who I'll refer to as S and C. We were 14 at the time, and none of us had ever been down there. So, with our supplies all set, we headed out after dinner on a summer night. We walked to the place we knew we could get in by squeezing through some meshed grating and pushing our way in. We got all of our bags in too and made our way down the tunnel. It was still light out, but that disk of bright light behind us was getting smaller and smaller as we flipped our lights on. If you've been in a subway, you know what it looks like. This was no different, just abandoned. There was spray paint and stuff on the walls, and I really wish I had a camera back then to capture what it looked like. It was noticeably cooler than outside, as I recall, and we weren't talking much. S jumped off the platform and shone his flashlight on something on the ground. It was a plastic bag, and something was leaking out of it. C and I jumped down for a closer look too, and I found what I remember was a piece of thin pipe or something, and I poked the bag with it. It was soft and made a squishy noise when I pressed it, and S recoiled, saying, "Holy shit, that smells terrible." The bag broke a bit, and this black stuff came out and pooled around the bag, and the most awful stench filled the air. I pulled my shirt over my nose and found a loose end of the bag and opened it up. It was 2 dead dogs. That's when C whispered, "Look!" He was looking in a far corner. There were at least 24 bags that looked just like this one, scattered around, and some were piled up on one side. I backed up, saying, "Gross, man, that's so sick." S asked aloud if we thought the bags were full of animals. C said he wasn't going to check, and we got out of there and went deeper into the tunnel to explore more and get away from that smell. We checked out more of the place, and while it was cool, there wasn't a lot of variety. Well, maybe there just wasn't any back then. It was just platforms in the subway tunnel itself. There are nooks and crannies, and we saw a lot of garbage and evidence of people either partying down there or maybe even living, but nothing that was that awesome. So we decided that, while it's cool, we're getting a little bored, and we decided to head back. We stopped for a minute as C needed to adjust his backpack, and that's when we heard a noise coming from the direction of where we came in. Just sort of a clinking noise, like a pipe on concrete or metal. We all looked up the tunnel, but didn't make a big deal out of it and kept on going back to where we needed to go. Our lights were bouncing around the floor and walls, and we were getting close to the main way we got in the tight squeeze. At this point, there were 3 loud bangs, and we all stopped. It was right before we saw all those bags, and I shone my light around and saw the first bag, and then S let out a shriek. C and I looked up, and there were 2 men standing near the other bags looking back at us, each holding those pieces of pipe or whatever. One smashed the ground with his stick, and we just stood there looking at these guys. They were both filthy beyond description. Beards, dirt from like 1985 on their face, and their clothes were all ripped and stained.
"You were messing with our animals,"
said a throaty voice that sounded like there was also water coming out of it, like a gurgle. We were in shock. Had these guys been there the entire time we were down there? The guy who didn't bang his stick moved toward us, and we were frozen in fear as he said,
"Come here, you little bastards. We've got plenty of bags for you."
He reached an arm up onto the platform to pull himself up, and I swear his whole forearm was covered in maggots. I almost puked, and C yelled out, "Run!" I turned and we took off, but S was still standing there as this guy crawled up onto the platform. I turned around and went back to him, smashed him in the arm and wake him up from his terror coma or whatever the fuck he was doing, and he finally turned back to me. We started running after C when I heard a clanking noise, and then I tripped. The other guy had thrown his piece of pipe or whatever at us, and it caught my legs, and I sprawled onto my hands and knees, and S kept running. I didn't even turn around to see where those guys were. I just scrambled back up and began running/limping as fast as I could. I could see the faint light of the exit and the guys' flashlights bouncing up and down. I could also hear the grating being pulled to one side, and I knew I was almost there. Behind me were shouts from the two men, but I just kept booking it. I saw S get through and slammed into the grating not long after, pushing myself through in total fear, but forgetting to take my rucksack off. I'm screaming for help, and C yells, "Take your bag off! Take your bag off!" I did. I jammed it through and then forced my way through just in time as I heard the men just like 10 feet from behind. I landed in a heap and C grabbed my arm and pulled me up. We turned to the entrance with our lights and shone them on the two guys who were just standing there. One was holding a dead cat's head in his hand. All three of us were backing up, half in that daze again, horrified at what we were looking at, and one of the guys said,
"Don't come back. We know where you live and we'll find you."
Again, that gurgling voice. And that was it. We turned and got the hell out of there and ran and ran and ran. We didn't stop until we got to our neighborhood, and then we went to C's basement and collapsed on the floor. The next 2 hours was nothing but, what the hell was that? Holy shit, did you see the maggots all over that guy? Hey, thanks for waiting up for me, assholes, and who do you think they were? Do you think they live there? We never got any answers to any of our questions, but I said I was never going back down there, and I never did. All three of us still kept urbexing until we kind of drifted apart. I went to a trade school and worked as a lineman in South Carolina. C went to a big-time university and moved to California, and S got a job at his family car dealership where he still is in our hometown. Once in a while we bump into each other when me or C goes home for a holiday or whatever, and the first thing we start talking about is that trip. The image of those two guys at that grating, holding a dead cat head, will never leave my brain. Scary Forest Experience by 50 Shades of Diglett. I have a creepy story. Myself and 4 friends were camping in central/northern Ontario, Canada, one random weekend. It had been a beautifully hot and sunny summer, and we'd never at all been camping together. Tons separately, but never together. We drove in separate cars because we had to leave at different times. In fact, I drove my parents' caravan at the time. Anyway, I'm driving myself and 2 of my closest friends listening to some Dallas Green and some Jack Johnson, just inducing the chillest of vibes for our trip. We finally made it to the campsite, and our other 2 friends, my now friend and his wife, are already there with their shit set up and a fire going and some dinner being prepared for us. It was pretty sweet. The first night, nothing eventful happened, but the second night got weird. We'd been up drinking since basically breakfast and had a pretty awesome day. We were boating on a small lake and had tried a hand at fishing, but the lake was essentially barren. We got back to our campsite, got a little more tipsy, and made ourselves a wonderfully burnt campfire dinner. Parties started going on all over, and we were close enough to one of the major beaches nearby to hear the insane party that was going on. We were too drunk to locate it and make our way over there, but we didn't care. Well, I kind of cared, because around 1 in the morning, my buddy and I went to go to sleep in our tiny little tent, and we couldn't because of all the music and potentially sexy girls we heard screaming frequently. Now, here's where things get weird. After a couple of tosses and turns, neither of us can sleep. My friend and I are just shooting the shit, whispering, when, all of a sudden, we both realize that we can't hear anything outside of the tent. Then this weird buzzing sound is being emanated from what seems like somewhere in the sky, but appears to be relocating at a ridiculous speed. For example, top right corner 1 second, right beside us the next, top left corner thereafter, and so on. This strange buzzing went on for what felt like maybe 30 or 40 minutes, and we were entirely freaked out. There weren't any lights or anything, and we didn't actually feel anything nearby, physically or metaphorically. But it was there, and we heard it, and it had a tangible effect on our brains. The fact that we both heard it made me feel more sane. The sound eventually faded, and the sounds of partying slowly made their way back to its normal volume. Like when you bring your television down to 0 and then gradually increase the volume. Kind of like that. Not how normal sounds are supposed to work. Granted, they hadn't been working at all, but I digress. Eventually, the music and unfortunately the screaming girls started to dissipate, and I eventually fell asleep. I woke up suddenly, and I moved ever so slightly to see my friend lying on his back with his eyes wide open. We both looked at each other and slowly nodded. Neither of us said a word to each other. Suddenly, something brushed up against my side of the tent, of course. So now at this point, I'm freaking out in my head. And then we hear a very low, guttural sort of sound. Not really a growl, so to speak, but kind of like when your stomach makes a noise, but deeper, and if you could do it on purpose, I guess. It pretty much tilted me right then and there. Whatever this thing was continued to hang around our tent, and at some point it made distinct breathing noises, and then what sounded like maybe sniffing? Either way, we were royally freaked out. Whatever it was eventually left, and we started freaking out to each other because of what had happened earlier, and now we realize we're being sized up for rape by a giant black bear. But then the sounds took our adolescent brains in a different direction, like, what if those sky sounds were something completely different and had left someone to check everything out before it left? Sleeping was rough for the rest of the night. We'd been prepping breakfast and taking our equipment down when my friend brought up the noise and the animalistic sounds from last night and expected everyone to kind of say, "Yeah, wasn't that weird?" But no one else had heard anything. I mean, anything. They only heard the partying and had fallen asleep after it had started to dissipate early in the morning. So for what felt like 30 minutes, we were hounded by this weird, fast-moving sound that projected an incredibly strange buzzing sound that cut the rest of the world off from us, and no one else could corroborate what we were feeling. That really freaked us out. It was strange, and my simple brain couldn't think of anything as to what the buzzing could have been. I'll accept that the second set of sounds was probably a bear, despite the fact that it didn't sound like any bear I'd ever seen or heard before. But then again, I was tired and a little more than happy with my alcoholic consumption. Needless to say, forests can suck just as much as they can be awesome. My Dash for Life by Trojan85. I'm from London but was at university in Liverpool, which is most famous for being the home city of the Beatles. I was about 19 and not the most sociable guy, and lacked confidence with meeting girls. Anyway, I was at university, the campus for performing arts. I lived on the main campus and needed to take a bus to get between both campuses. My drama class had finished, and my classmates were leaving and going back to their own homes or into Liverpool city center. I went to the toilet to go take a leak, and when entering the toilet, noticed suddenly there was a man at the sink, and he was looking at me in the mirror. I don't know why, but I had a sixth sense that there was something unsettling about this young white guy in his early 20s who was eyeballing me. Anyhow, I did my business and washed my hands and pretended to ignore the man who still stood there at the basin. I think I said something like, "all right," as in the north of the UK, they're a lot more friendly than southerners like myself. Getting no reply back, I just exited the toilet and started my way back to Liverpool city center. It was about a 20-minute walk through the roads and outer city center, so I gave no more thought about the strange young man in the toilet. However, that soon changed as I looked back about 5 minutes later and noticed that he was walking in the same direction as me. I felt a little unnerved, but maybe it was just a coincidence as he was going to the city center too, so I just carried on my journey. Sometime later, walking past the outer city center, I noticed the man was still following me, but now he was closer. I don't know why, but again, my sixth sense told me that I needed to be worried, and I quickened up my pace to see if this was the case, or if I was over-fretting about nothing. When I approached a long walkway to the main shopping center, I noticed this man was still following me and staring at me with a deadpan stare. Literally like a walking zombie. Freaking out but not wanting to make a scene, I ran down the escalator in the shopping mall, and when I looked up, I noticed the man was coming down the escalator at a fast pace, and his focus was still all on me. I was now thinking this man wants to do something bad to me, and I don't want to find out exactly what. So I turned past the food court and ducked into a shop and hid by the corner. I knew that I would have been out of the view of the man, and didn't dare look up to see if he had rushed past the shop. It was about 3 or 5 minutes later that I felt much safer, and I exited the shop thinking that I had successfully escaped my tormentor, only to see the man a short time later walking in the opposite direction, and again walking directly towards me, and staring directly at me with no expression. Thinking I was in big trouble now, but surrounded by shoppers, I just walked past each other and nothing happened. My heart felt like it could have exploded, but it calmed right down as I noticed a couple of police officers walking into the shopping center and in my direction. I looked around to see if the man was following me or in my view, but he thankfully had vanished. I didn't speak to the police officers or anyone else about what just happened, as I felt embarrassed about the event, and probably the guy had a mental problem and I had caused a reaction or probably caught his attention in the toilet. I left Liverpool soon after. I didn't enjoy the drama course or the really wet winter weather. I am now in my early 30s and a special constable with the Met Police in London. I don't know whatever happened to that man, and if he was a student of the university or what. I'm just grateful that he wasn't able to catch me on that day back in 2004. Now There Are Two, submitted by Death from Afar. To set the scene, this story took place in central Texas around 2004 or 2005, not far from the Bigfoot story in Volume 28. At the time, my wife and I had young twin daughters, and our son was a toddler. Since this story, almost all of the residents have moved away, but at the time, we had great relationships with nearly every person living on our street. Impromptu driveway cookouts and get-togethers were the norm. Even if we didn't know certain neighbors well, we knew their faces and vehicles intimately. Unfamiliar pedestrians and vehicles drew obvious attention. Eventually, we developed a close set of immediate neighbors and became good friends. We developed our own unofficial neighborhood watch, and nothing happened on our street without our knowing it. It was satisfying to know we were looked out for at all times, and we felt safe, and life was good. At one of our driveway cookouts, our closest neighbor, who I will call B, we were getting the grills ready and seasoning meat. With my back to the street, I said something to B, and he didn't respond. I didn't look up, but said with a laugh, "Fine, ignore me then, you rude bastard." B still didn't retort, which was very much out of character for him. I peered up from my seasoning task to see him staring intently past me. I know the look. That's an unsettled look of deep concern. B had 2 daughters as well, and he was always vigilant. Something had captured his attention, and not in a good way. His creep meter was redlining, and I knew it by the tense look on his face. I spun around to see a man. A really big, a giant of a man walking on the sidewalk across the street. This man was gargantuan. My estimation of the man was maybe 30 years of age, 6'8", and over 500 pounds. At least. I'm 6'1" and 220. This guy could have eaten me like a light snack. Freaking huge is what I'm getting at. You get the point. My first glimpse of the man was at 40 yards or more, and I instantly felt as though static electricity washed over my entire body. While living through several harrowing events, I have never experienced such a visceral reaction in my entire life. My own creep meter was spewing smoke and sparks, though I didn't definitively know why. It's impossible to accurately describe that feeling, and I've had similar feelings since, but nothing so intense. Without a word or an invitation, the giant man donned a cliché ear-to-ear grin and walked across the street towards us, waving. Not like a, "Hey, neighbor," sort of wave, but rather a wave like a circus clown would do to a young child. Back then, my wife was blissfully ignorant to the evils that could befall an attractive young blonde 20-something female. Everyone was inherently good in her mind. So, when I looked at her to give her the sign to round up the kids and move to safety, she was, as usual, in her life is grand mode. In her defense, her chair was set around the fire pit with her back to the road, so she couldn't see all of what was going on behind her. However, that didn't last long. As the huge man walked into B's driveway where we were gathered, he happily strolled right up to me, never letting his creepy smile fade. With every tooth in his head showing, he began to speak with a lumbering idiocy about him and said, "So, y'all having a party? I like parties. What are y'all cooking? Chicken? I like chicken. Mind if I have a piece? Looks real tasty. Yum." What 30-year-old man says yum? He provided no time for answers as he quickly snatched a drumstick from the plate. At this moment, B, who was behind me with the grill between us, snapped his fingers loudly and projected his voice towards my wife sitting in the driveway. "Hey!" My wife looked up sharply. "Take the kids and go," he said sternly. The only time I took my eyes off the huge man was to ensure my wife was complying. She absolutely was. As she and my kids hastily retreated towards our home, I looked back at that large man who had closed to within mere inches from me now, still flashing that plastic smile. I arched backward a bit and said, "Hey, you need to take a step or 10 straight backwards. I don't like people in my space." While still holding the drumstick, he slowly backed up, but only a half step. I then made it abundantly clear for him to keep backing up and that I was becoming uncomfortable. By uncomfortable, what was coursing through every fiber in my body was, if you stay where you are, I'm going to knock your gelatinous ass out. My philosophy is and always has been, there is no reason to be that close to another person unless the two of you are making babies, and he and I weren't. The subtle hint didn't stick. B said gruffly, "Dude, the man told you to back the fuck up." The huge man, still smiling and now waving childishly again, said, "Hi, my name's Andrew, Andy." I quipped, "Do you mean to tell me you don't even know your name?" He said, "It's Andy. My name is Andy." Obviously flustered, he nervously asked, "May I have this piece of chicken? It sure looks delicious." He was trying to sell this hard. Still behind me, I heard B softly whisper, "What the fuck?" I told the guy, "Sure you can have the chicken. There's just one problem. It's fucking raw." The man never broke from his fake facade. He said rapidly, "That's okay. I have time to wait until it's cooked. I bet it will be delicious. Y'all look like great chefs." Chefs? Chefs? Chefs don't cook on a rusty-ass grill out in the driveway. This encounter was turning stranger by the second. By this time, my wife had locked the kids inside and came to see if all was well. At that moment, B's wife, we'll call her A, drove up with their 2 daughters. A immediately noticed the giant in her driveway. Not like he could be missed, but I digress. She opened the door to her minivan to let out their youngest child, who was around 8 at the time. The huge man noticed the little girl climbing out of the van, and we could see him actually salivating. It was absolutely disgusting, and B lost his shit. He hollered, "What are you looking at, freak? You like little girls? Are you a pedophile? Take your deranged, child-raping fat ass away from here before I cut your fucking throat." B was angry. To most people, this would have been their cue to make tracks, and do so promptly. Not Big Boy. He turned to B and asked, "What about the chicken? Do I still get my piece of chicken? It sure looks delicious." I could actually see B's blood pressure top out, and his head was about to explode like a party popper. I got right by B and whispered, "What wonder if this dude has problems. He isn't seeing what we are seeing. I mean, let's cook him a piece of chicken and send him away. B said, yeah, no shit he has problems. He's getting hard over my 8-year-old daughter, now you want to feed him? B's delivery was flawless, and I laughed. After a few seconds, B reluctantly agreed, and we did cook the chicken. Sort of. B undercooked the chicken on purpose. He said, I hope he gets the pedophile version of Montezuma's Revenge. Laughing loudly, I pointed out, I'm fairly certain Montezuma's Revenge isn't any way related to salmonella poisoning. B said it right on point. It will be if he eats that undercooked yard bird. We got a good laugh out of it. With his chicken in hand, the man walked all the way to the end of our street, turned west and walked out of sight. Briefly, we discussed the strange nature of the experience, but we didn't let it affect our party. We had a good time. Perhaps B more than all of us combined as he fell asleep in his lawn chair just onto the surface of the asphalt street. I contemplated duct taping him to the chair and leaving him there overnight, but his wife simply overruled my plan. Okay then, another time. By the way, I don't drink alcohol, so I derive immense pleasure from screwing with my drunk friends. It's just one of the little things that make me smile. The next afternoon, I was mowing the lawn. On my final pass headed toward B's house, I see the giant man standing in the exact spot we had noticed him the afternoon before, except this time, he was walking a dog. Again, he was smiling, and extra slowly, he raised his arm and waved that childish wave again. I have goosebumps simply from recalling that image. Just then, my wife stepped outside to ask me a question, and I turned off the mower. I turned to her and told her the huge guy from the previous night was across the street and to not look in his direction. She said softly but urgently, He's here, he's here, he's here! I turned to see Mr. Tons of Fun standing in my freshly mowed and perfectly manicured grass only 2 feet from me. I asked, What the hell are you doing? Get off my grass! He said with a huge smile, You're standing in the grass. While I begrudgingly admit he made an excellent point, let me be upfront and honest. I am not a patient person. My ability to tolerate people's stupid bullshit already bordered on non-existence, and this son of a bitch had plucked at my last nerve until it broke. I screamed at him, It's my motherfucking grass, you dim bastard! Get the fuck off of my goddamn grass before I kick the ever-loving shit out of you! He stuck out his hand and said, Hi, my name's Eric. I don't think I caught your name. I said, And you never will, Andy, Eric, or whoever the fuck you are. Go away. I saw the man's smile quickly fade to anger, and he balled up both fists. I know the posture, and I assured him he didn't want to do what he was thinking. It could have only ended badly for him. He turned, and without incident, walked through my freaking grass, mashing up huge-ass footprints in it. It was like a train running over a penny. A few days passed with no incidents until I opened the front door to see the man having already approached my wife as she was attempting to exit her vehicle. The guy had a different dog in his arms, and he was so close to my wife's vehicle she could barely crack open the door. She was uncomfortable, I could see that, so I strolled up behind him without his noticing. I listened for about 20 seconds, and he was asking my wife a seemingly endless string of questions about our home, our kids, her, me, everything possible to keep her there. She lied about it all and told him she needed to go inside. He said creepily, Why? We're just here talking. No reason to leave. I poked him very briskly between his shoulder blades, and as politely as I could muster, I asked, What the fuck are you doing? He nearly came out of his skin and muttered something unintelligible as he quickly shuffled away. I must admit, for a big fella, he walked on cat's feet. He was like a fat ninja with enormous calves. My wife looked at me and said, I thought you would never get out here. And it turns out he had approached her from behind and blocked her in her own vehicle for 10 minutes before I noticed she was even home. After that, we worked out a plan for me to be in the driveway when she did come home. Problem solved, right? Ha! Not quite. I decided to follow the man from a distance to see where he lived. I changed clothing and pulled a bike off the rack in the garage and set off in pursuit. Again, the man turned west at the end of our street and turned again, and again, and again, and again in a seemingly aimless pattern. After a period of time, it became apparent to me. This man did not reside in the neighborhood at all. He was walking towards the nearby farm-to-market road, which led to a very well-known and sketchy part of the neighboring county about 5 miles away. I ducked into the weeds and watched the man walk up to a beat-up white car parked on the side of the farm-to-market road about a quarter of a mile west from the entrance of our neighborhood. He opened the trunk of the car, tossed the small dog inside, and screamed something profane at it. He slammed the trunk lid, and the dog yelped. I whispered aloud to myself, "What the hell?" I tried to pedal close enough to get a plate number, but he sped away. Over the next 3 weeks, the man's appearances became more and more frequent until we were seeing him twice and occasionally 3 times a day. Oddly, no one ever saw him unless I or my wife were home, and he always seemed to stroll by within seconds of us arriving home. His attention was definitely fixated on my wife, though he had no qualms about darting over and running his hole on me, presumably waiting for my wife to emerge. Yeah, we were very much aware of the emerging pattern, but we realized something just as disturbing. Each time he was seen, he had a different dog with him. Never the same dog twice. I would estimate personally seeing him with at least 15 different dogs of all shapes, sizes, and breeds. Who knows how many dogs my neighbors saw that we didn't? And where does somebody get that many dogs that quickly? I've heard stories of people saying, "I saw signs but never suspected anything would happen to me." And I can assure you, we were very attuned to the peculiarities. We knew something would happen, we just didn't know what, or when. We had that stranger danger discussion with the kids again, and never let the baby out of sight, even for a moment. We ensured the security system was in tip-top order and added 2 anti-access bars to each window. We were as secure as a home with windows could be. My wife and I went to our local police department to report the strange man and his behavior. My wife had snapped some pictures of him too, and we brought those along. We explained the happenings, and the officer's infinite wisdom? He haughtily asked us with a smirk, "So, you want to report a big friendly guy living near you who likes to walk dogs and chat with the neighbors?" That pissed me off. I asked him if he had forgotten all the other things we had just reported, such as his fixation on my wife, and he replied, "Look, your wife is a very pretty young lady. A large, obese man has a chance to speak to her and he gets nervous and awkward. I don't think there's much to worry about." I told the officer straight to his face, "I want you to remember our faces, because you will be seeing us again about this case. Good or bad, this case won't end today." He looked at me in stunned silence as my wife and I left the station. After our wasted visit to the police station, all sightings of the man abruptly ceased. Nothing. My wife and I wondered if the man somehow knew we had gone to the police and that scared him off. We had no way to know, but we were enjoying his not lurking around. I did, however, never quite shake the feeling of being watched periodically. It eased up a bit, but it didn't fade away entirely. About 10 days passed with no more sightings of the man. We had even gone door to door showing the man's picture, asking people if they had seen him and to be wary of him. No one had seen him, or at least no one admitted to seeing him. We were beginning to breathe a little easier, and on a lazy Saturday afternoon, my wife asked me for the keys to my truck because she had to go pick up something. I don't recall what it was, and at the time I had a crew cab Ford diesel, which was distinctive. The windows were tinted with very, very dark film to keep potential thieves from peering inside. Momentarily, you will understand why that is of crucial importance. We said our goodbyes, and I walked her to the truck and looked around before she drove away. I walked back inside and resumed my activities. No more than 5 minutes passed and our doorbell rang. Having friends and neighbors drop by often and unannounced was par for this particular course, so I walked to the door expecting to see B, since I saw him outside a little earlier that day. As I reached for the doorknob, I paused, and then checked the peephole. I felt something akin to what could only be described as swallowing a brick. It hit hard in the pit of my stomach. What I saw was Andy or Eric or whatever the hell the huge guy's name was, standing on my porch. But he wasn't alone. Now there were 2 men. I raced to grab my Colt 1911 A1 pistol from its hiding place, tucked it inside my rear waistband, and walked to the door. And then it dawned on me. They had watched my truck drive away and believed it was me. They think my wife is home alone. Now I was fucking pissed. I leaned forward to check the peephole once more, and the doorbell sounded again. I tried to take notice of the other man standing on my porch, but he was a full step behind the huge guy, standing on our sidewalk with his back to the door. I pulled the pistol, checked the chamber, cocked the hammer, and placed it back in my waistband. As I readied myself, I remembered we had just installed a solid glass storm door. It was between the front door and the two men, so that meant there was at least some barrier between the men and myself. I loudly unlocked the front door as I peered through the peephole once more. This time, the other man turned around to face the door. I took but a second to gather information about him. Late 20s, Caucasian, small-statured male, 5'7", maybe 145 pounds, medium-length, messy, dirty blonde hair. Boom, got it. I grabbed the doorknob and jerked the door open swiftly. The large man was startled and completely taken aback by my presence. The strange thing is, the small man wasn't moved at all. I looked square into the smaller man's eyes, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was face to face with unadulterated evil. His eyes told me everything about him. Dark, soulless eyes with no compassion or remorse. For a moment, and for the first time since I was a child, I felt true fear inside of me. Mind you, I had a loaded firearm close at hand, and throwing dukes was not foreign to my personality. But this shook me. This new guy had a presence about him which I can only describe as a laser-light show of evil. It was a heavy, intense feeling, and every bad situation up to that one and since, my natural reaction was, and still is, to get very calm and methodical. It's not bravery or machismo, but rather an involuntary response to certain situations. However, in the briefest of moments, I was scared for myself and my kids playing nearby in their rooms. But it got worse. The visual exchange lasted probably only a couple of seconds. Then, the small man coldly turned his back to me so I could no longer see his features. Shit, I said quietly in my mind. He's done this before. I turned my attention to the big man, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In his left hand, hanging straight down by his side and tucked somewhat behind his leg, I noticed a video camera. All of it added up in that one instant. They were here to harm my wife and video the attack. Not in this house, motherfuckers, I screamed in my mind. I slipped into calm mode. Fear completely left me, and I knew whatever was going to happen right now. I politely asked what they needed. The big man who did all the talking stumbled over his words and asked, "Is your wife home?" I asked harshly, "Why do you ask?" He stuttered and stammered, Well, you see, At this time, he paused and turned to look at the shorter man. The short man looked at him, nodded in acknowledgement, and turned away again. This is going to be bad, I thought to myself. The big man again tried to peddle his story as he stumbled over nearly every word. We're doing a project for our college class, and we wanted to interview your wife. And you thought two strange men showing up to my doorstep unannounced was the way to go about it? I asked, very annoyed. His mouth fell slack-jawed. Apparently etiquette somehow passed him by. Imagine that. I took the opportunity of his silence to ask questions of my own. Me. What college do you attend? One in the area. There are no colleges in this area. You two are a little too old to be in college. Not too old. What class is the project for? Now he stood slack-jawed and looked at the shorter man for assistance. I asked you, what class? English. English what? English literature? Yeah, English literature. Are you asking me or are you telling me? Telling you? So you want to do what? Document my wife's thoughts on Taming of the Shrew? At this point, I hit him with a series of questions and did not wait for answers. I paused only long enough to allow him to step on his tongue. Who's the professor of the class? Again, what college did you say this is, and what's the TA? And what book is this about? How do you know if my wife has even read the book? Why do you need my wife without me being present? And part of my skepticism, Hoss, but none of this shit is adding up. I paused for about 5 seconds to let the questioning soak in. The big dude was dumbfounded. He once again looked back toward the smaller man for answers, but he was providing none. The big guy turned back to me and asked, "Can we just please talk to your wife? It's important." I waited a few seconds and calmly said with a smile, "Sure, brother. Wait here. I'll go get her." I closed the front door and locked it. I pulled my pistol from my waistband and looked through the peephole again. They were both obviously flustered and were arguing inaudibly. I knew this was go time. Now or never. Holding the pistol in my right hand, I opened the door with my left and acted as if I was speaking to my wife, who was walking to the door and out of their view. Just before I unlocked the storm door, I said, "Because these guys just want to ask you a few questions for their class project. They don't care if you don't have makeup on." I let loose a subtle laugh and a smile as if my wife believed I was playing a joke on her. I unlocked the storm door, and at that moment, I abruptly pushed the door open and jammed my Colt directly under the big boy's chin, and pressed with enough force as to tip his head backward about 30 degrees. He reacted as one would expect someone to act who just had a large handgun unexpectedly crammed into their neck. He dropped the video camera, and his hands commenced to waving, and he made loud groaning sounds as he stepped backwards onto my wife's flowers. Through gritted teeth, I told him very harshly, "If I ever see you or Tiny Tim over there anywhere near my family again, I will kill you where you stand. So you'd better find a new fucking place to live. You feeling me, motherfucker?" Sounded like he had suffered a stroke. He groaned. Okay, as he stumbled backwards and ran down the sidewalk, across the driveway, and presumably away from me. I immediately turned to the small man, who unbelievably still had not turned around. I told him loudly and slowly, "Turn the fuck around very slowly." He slowly turned, and as he did, I noticed a cocky, wide smirk on his face. This guy was unmoved by the gun pointed directly at his face. He didn't give a shit. He was the mastermind behind all of this, and he wanted me to know it. I walked right up to him and pushed the muzzle of the firearm between his eyes as I gripped the weapon with both hands. I pushed with considerable force and rocked his head backward to an uncomfortable angle. I asked him calmly, "Does it look like I give a fiddler's fuck if you die in my yard today?" "You messed with the wrong motherfucker, Chief." He said nothing, and I had said all I needed to say. With the muzzle still firmly pressed against his forehead, we had about a 10-second stare-down. It lasted until the smirk faded from his face. It took all of that for him to realize I was not bluffing. A wise move. Without ever uttering one word, he put his hands out about waist-high, showed me his hands were empty, and slowly walked backwards towards my driveway. He then turned and walked away, never looking back. I immediately ran inside, called my wife, and gave her the headlines. She laughed at me. I couldn't understand what she found so humorous about the situation, and then it dawned on me. I was still so calm, she thought I was kidding. I had no urgency in my voice yet. She told me later that I sounded no differently than if I were informing her what kind of sandwich I wanted for lunch. Also, I never pass up an opportunity to play a practical joke or scare the hell out of someone. I snapped out of get her done mode, and I told her I wasn't screwing around. With some reticence, she believed me and came home shortly thereafter. As we walked inside, she noticed her prized flowers were trampled flat. She pointed and asked, "What the hell happened here?" I explained the flowers were the least of our concerns. We sat down at the kitchen table, and I told her the story in greater detail. Her eyes welled up with tears, and she began to tremble slightly. Through tears, she angrily asked, "Why were they here? Why did they come to our home?" I explained to her my belief was they were there for her or for her and the kids. She rose from the table and walked away for a private cry before coming out a short while later to sit on the floor to play with the kids. I could see it in her eyes and on her face. She was reflecting on how quickly all that she is and all that she loved could be taken away by a bad person with intent. The next day I walked into the local police department, and lo and behold, our friendly neighborhood naysayer was back behind the desk again. I asked him, "You remember me?" He nodded, and I instructed him to grab a pen. This is going to take a while. I told the whole story, and he called in 2 more officers to hear it. They listened intently as he wrote what he needed to write, and I filed the report. I informed all of them, under no uncertain terms, if either man set foot near my family again, I would kill them both, and I didn't care where it happened. The officer looked up at me and paused before saying, "I believe you." Then I walked out. We have not seen the men again, nor did we hear anything from the police. Before this event, my wife was staunchly against firearms in our home. She didn't mind so much that I had them or shot them, but was uncomfortable with them being inside the house. After this event, she eventually asked me to teach her how to shoot a gun. We bought one for her, and she learned to use it with proficiency. Late one night in a Walmart parking lot some 12 years later, she would be forced to draw that gun to ward off a man trying to open her driver's side door just as she had gotten into her vehicle. She drew the firearm, and he threw up his hands before running away in a flash. My wife came home to her family that night, unharmed. Folks, do yourself a favor and learn to defend yourself. Be it a gun, a knife, or hand-to-hand combat like Krav Maga or Jiu-Jitsu, all of the above. Learn it and incorporate it into your daily life, because you never know the moment you will be forced to put it into action to save your life or the life of someone you love. Prepare for the bad, but pray for the good. I have just recounted the day that forever changed the way my entire family views the world. A large part of our innocence was lost that day, and we knew we would never be able to regain it. I find solace in the fact that my family was unharmed, but it still crosses my mind, and I shudder to think what would have happened if it were me who had left in my truck that day instead of my wife. It still makes me incredibly sad. Doorbell at the Cottage by Concon Blazzini. I've always been the kind of person to believe only what I see and little of what I hear. It's for this reason that I don't really believe in God or anything spiritual like that. So then, does believing in ghosts make me a complete hypocrite? Who knows? My dad has always been a level-headed and intelligent man, and he swears to me that he has had an encounter with a ghost. He used to work at a bar in Toronto called the Jarvis House. This bar was apparently an old hotel, and was rumored to be haunted in some of the rooms upstairs. We all have that tough guy friend who claims that they aren't afraid of ghosts, and my dad's circle of friends was no different. One night after work, he and all his bouncer buddies decided to go up to one of the rooms and provoke the ghosts. My dad and his friend Walt were a bit skeptical about the whole idea, even though deep down inside they knew there could be no such thing as ghosts. But my dad's other friend, Woody, was a big man who was your typical non-believer and decided that he would go into the most haunted room in the building and start taunting the ghosts by yelling at them and poking fun at the whole situation. My dad claims that all of a sudden the hotel room door slammed shut and Woody began to scream things like, "Let me out!" and "Stop fucking around, you guys, this isn't funny!" At this point, my dad and Walt, who were both over 6 feet tall and pushing 210, started trying to break the door down by kicking it and ramming it with their shoulders, while Woody was still inside begging to be let out. Then, all of a sudden, with no force of their own, the door swung open, and Woody was standing in the middle of the room, looking as pale as a ghost, wearing a look of utter shock and terror. This is because he claims he was punched in the face by a ghost, and his black eye confirmed it. To this day, my dad and all of his friends firmly believe that ghosts actually exist. And that was sort of a pre-story to what happened to me last month up in the Muskokas. For those that don't know, Muskoka is a huge place for cottages up north where there are a bunch of beautiful lakes and thick forests. My grandparents have a cottage up there, which is great because I get to go up all the time and enjoy the various activities on the lake, like boating, tubing, water skiing, swimming, you name it. However, I have vowed to never go up there again after what had happened. I've always been a fan of being scared and watched lots of scary movies. My parents know this about me, and I've always told them that I wish our house was haunted so I could experience the true terror of actually seeing a ghost. At this point in time, my grandparents were getting kind of old and couldn't perform all the usual chores and tasks that needed to be done at the cottage. That included cutting firewood for the fireplace, sealing the windows, and taking the boat out of the lake, among smaller things too. My parents asked me if I would like to go up to the cottage one weekend to perform all of these tasks for my grandpa because he was quite ill and couldn't do it himself. My mom egged me on and told me that it would be a good scary experience for me to go up there by myself. I also had to go alone because my parents were both going to Key West for a couple of weeks to look for an apartment to buy. I decided I would volunteer to go because I could use the extra cash, and living at the cottage all weekend with a nice bag of weed and my Xbox was something I was really interested in. Fast forward to the Friday night at the cottage. I had just finished a bowl and was playing Black Ops after a long day of chopping wood, cutting down trees, and tidying up the place. I was mid-game when I heard the doorbell ring. It scared the shit out of me because it was about 1 a.m. and the cottage was pretty secluded. It rested at the end of a long driveway as well, so nobody in their right mind would want to make that walk in the blackness of the night. It was a bit cowardly of me, but I just took my eyes off the television, listened for about 10 seconds, and then resumed playing my game. I was way too scared to go check the door. My mind kept telling me it was a murderer, so I just laid low, and acted like nobody was home, and eventually just went to bed. I mean, why the hell does a cottage have a doorbell anyway? The next day was much like the first. More chores, I went for a swim, smoked a couple of bongs, and eventually went back to my man cave in the basement. However, during my swim I noticed I was not alone. I was just floating out on an inner tube when I heard what sounded like 2 young boys playing on the shore about 50 yards away from me. The tree line is right on the shore, so I couldn't see them, but I felt comfort in knowing that there were at least people around me. It then dawned on me that it could have been those 2 little shits who rang the doorbell last night in an attempt to prank me with the classic Nicky Nicky 9 Doors trick. This really calmed me down, as I was kind of on edge about the night before, and any excuse I could rationalize made me feel much better. As previously stated, I was downstairs in my gaming den with my bong and munchies, when the goddamn doorbell rang again. I was pretty high, so I figured either it was those kids or, man, I'm just tripping out really hard. Regardless, I was not as scared as the night before, so I decided to be a hero and go check it out. I ran upstairs and swung the door open to see that no one was there. I walked out onto the deck and the motion sensor lights flashed on. If somebody was ringing my doorbell, then they would certainly have set off the motion sensor, right? I got that sinking feeling in my stomach and ran back inside, locking the door in haste. I Skyped with my mom the next day from Key West and explained to her the doorbell incident. I told her that I thought it was the kids next door playing a prank, and it was at this point that my mom looked a little worried. I remember the conversation going something like this. Mom, what kids? Me. The ones who live in the cottage to our left. I heard them screwing around in the woods yesterday. Mom, there is no cottage to the left. Or the right. There's not another cottage in either direction for hundreds of yards. Me. Gulp. I then called my grandparents and asked them if they had ever experienced any problems with the doorbell, or if anything strange had ever happened to them at all at the cottage. My grandma said no, and that my story was strange and it gave her the creeps. I eventually finished up with the last of my chores for that day and was preparing for my last night at the cottage, which was great, because I was pretty much out of weed at this point. Later that night, around 9 o'clock, I got a phone call from my grandma. She sounded very panicked and told me that 2 young boys had drowned in the lake by her cottage the day before I had arrived on the Thursday. Apparently, they had snuck out at night to go canoeing, and the canoe capsized. The scariest part was that their bodies were found lodged against our dock. After hanging up, something compelled me to look down towards the dock, and it was at this point that I could have sworn I saw a young boy standing on the shore, looking up at the cottage and directly at me. His hair appeared to be soaking wet, and he looked angry. I immediately shut the blinds, ran downstairs, and hid in the basement. 1 a.m. rolled around, and again the doorbell rang. Without much haste, I went upstairs with a flashlight to go check the door. I always said I wanted to see a ghost, so I sucked everything up and explored the boundaries of my willpower. I swung open the door expecting the worst, but found nobody there. The motion sensor came on again, and I heard what sounded like footsteps running through the forest. Little footsteps, like a kid's. I stepped out of the cottage and looked up, around, left, right, and then down. There were wet footprints on the deck. I noped the shit out of that, gathered up my stuff, and started driving back home at 1 a.m. I have never driven up that driveway faster in my life. I haven't told anyone in my family about the wet footprints, because they would undoubtedly think I was insane. Thanks for listening, gang, and thanks for all the likes and comments each week. I appreciate the support. I appreciate the support and feedback. And if you haven't done so, why not give a like, leave a comment, share this channel, and subscribe if you haven't. I love bringing you ad-free content. That's why I offer you the option of giving me a tip at my Patreon page. For just as little as $1 a month, you can help support this channel. There's a link for that along with my links to all my social media in the description. Remember to send all of your true scary stories to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. And I'm still looking at merchandise and doing a live stream soon, so in the meantime, everyone be excellent to each other. Until the next episode, be wary of things that go bump in the night. Could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.